Let me handle it, before you ruin everyone's deed. Nung said it the way you'd correct a child who'd colored outside the lines patient. On the surface. Contempt underneath. The whole family was gathered in my front room for my husband's death anniversary. Plates of food still steaming on the table. Incense smoke curling up toward the rafters. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Loud enough that my son Hoa looked down at his rice bowl instead of looking at me. I didn't answer her. I just smiled. The small smile I've worn for 40 years whenever someone underestimates me. The one that doesn't reach my eyes because it isn't meant to. I reached for the teapot, poured myself another cup, and let the silence sit there in the room like a held breath. Nobody understood why I wasn't angry. I watched it confuse them more than any shouting could have. Hoa glanced at me sideways. Nyung's husband, my younger son, shifted in his seat. Uncomfortable, in the way men get when they sense something is wrong but can't name it. Even Nung herself faltered for half a second, waiting for a reaction that never came. She didn't know that 3 weeks earlier, a man named Dart had come to our garden with a measuring tape and a clipboard, and that I had stood at my kitchen window watching him pace off distances that didn't match what I remembered. She didn't know I had already made one phone call to the district land records office. She didn't know what I kept wrapped in oilcloth inside the lacquered box on my husband's altar, 3 feet from where she now sat, eating my food, and calling me senile in front of his photograph. I have learned, over 70 years, that the people who talk the loudest about protecting you are often the ones who need you distracted. I let my eyes drift to the altar at the far end of the room. My husband Hung's photograph looked back at me, black and white, taken the year before he died. The year he was still the one who measured this land with his own hands and stamped it with the seal of the commune. The incense had burned halfway down, a thin gray line of smoke rising straight up before bending, caught by a draft from the open door. The smell of it filled the room the way it always had on his death anniversary: sandalwood, faint and sweet, mixed with the smell of boiled chicken and fish sauce from the kitchen. 42 years ago, almost to this same week, I had stood in this same house as a young bride, 23 years old, learning how to fold incense paper the way his mother taught me. I had not known then that I would spend the rest of my life learning how to watch people more carefully than I watched the rice pot, how to notice the half-second pause before someone lied, how to hold my face still when my chest was on fire. A teacher I worked under once, back when I was 26, and newly hired as a clerk for the Commune People's Committee, told me something I never forgot. He said, "Lan, in this job, you will sign your name to more truth and more lies than you can count, and the only thing that matters is which file you keep for yourself." I had laughed at the time, young and unsure what he meant. I understood it fully. 20 years later, the day I quietly made a copy of every land document that passed through my hands, involving our own family's property, and locked the originals in places no one would think to look. Not out of distrust of my husband, I trusted him with everything I had, but because I had watched, in my decades behind that desk, how easily paper could be made to lie, how easily a number could shift from one decimal point to another, how a boundary line drawn in 1990 could become, on a newer map, a boundary line drawn somewhere else entirely, and no one would ever know unless they had kept the old one. Still water runs deepest. My mother used to say that to me when I was a girl, watching the river behind our village house, calm on the surface while the current underneath could pull a grown man under in seconds. I thought of it now, sitting at my own table, my daughter-in-law's voice still hanging in the air, sweet and venomous in equal measure. Let her think the water was calm. Let her think I hadn't noticed the surveyor's stakes driven into the soft earth at the edge of my garden, closer to my mango tree than they should have been. Let her think that grief and age had made me slow, that 40 years behind a commune desk had taught me nothing. I picked up my chopsticks and ate a piece of fish, slowly, the way I always did. Across the table, Aenyung was already talking about something else, already moving on, certain she had won something. I watched her laugh at something her husband said, watched the gold bracelet on her wrist catch the light from the window. She had no idea what was sitting 3 feet from her, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting. Before any of this, there was simply our life, mine and Hung's, built slowly, year by year, the way you build a house when you don't have much money but you have time. And you have each other. We married in 1976, the year after everything changed in this country, when the future felt uncertain but not unkind. He was 25 then, lean and quiet, with hands that had already grown rough from fieldwork even though his real gift was numbers and lines on paper. He'd been trained as a land surveyor before the war ended, one of the few in our district who understood how to read a map, how to use a transit and a chain to measure ground that had never been measured properly before. I was 23, newly graduated from the district training course, assigned as a clerk to the Commune People's Committee. We met because our work overlapped. His measurements became the documents I filed. His hand-drawn boundary lines became the records I copied into the commune's ledgers. I remember the first time I saw his handwriting, small and exact, every numeral perfectly formed, as if he believed that sloppiness on paper could cost someone their home one day. I think now that he did believe that, and he was right. We didn't have a grand wedding. We had a small ceremony at his family's house, his mother burning incense at the altar, that would later become ours, and a dinner of maybe 30 people, mostly relatives, and a few colleagues from the commune office. I wore my mother's dye, pale blue, let out at the waist, because I'd grown taller than she had been. Hung wore a borrowed white shirt that didn't quite fit his shoulders. I remember thinking, watching him stand awkwardly in it, that I had married a man who would never care about how he looked. Only about whether the things he built and measured were true. We moved into this house 2 years later, the one I still live in now, with its low-tiled roof and the garden out back that Hung had inherited from his father. It wasn't large, a few hundred square meters of soil that had been in his family for 2 generations, planted with mango and longan trees, a small patch for vegetables near the kitchen door. In 1990, when the commune undertook a full reserve of residential land in our area, a project Hung himself helped lead, he measured our own garden with the same exactness he gave every other plot in the district. I remember him coming home that evening, dust on his trousers, smiling the small private smile he rarely gave anyone but me. "I made it official," he said. "Our garden. Exactly as it is. No more, no less." He showed me the map that night by lamplight, his finger tracing the boundary line, the measurements written in his small, careful hand, the commune seal already stamped in red at the corner. I didn't think much of it then. It was simply paperwork, the kind that passed through our hands every day. I filed a copy in the commune archive, as required, and Hung kept the original, folded inside a wooden box on the altar shelf where his father's ashes had once rested. "Why keep it there?" I asked him once. "Because nothing gets lost from an altar," he said. "People are careless with drawers. They are not careless with their ancestors." I worked at the commune office for 28 years after that, watching boundaries shift and shrink and stretch as families divided land between sons and daughters, as new roads cut through old fields, as paperwork multiplied faster than anyone could properly track it. I learned to read intention in a document the way other people read intention in a face, a line drawn slightly too straight, a measurement rounded a little too conveniently, a stamp applied a little too quickly, without the usual cross-checking. Hung and I raised 2 sons in this house. Hoa, steady and quiet like his father, content to drive his truck up and down the national highway, and come home tired but unbothered. And our younger son, who married Nung 12 years ago, in a ceremony far more elaborate than mine, had been a banquet hall instead of a family courtyard, a band instead of an old cassette player, a dress rented from the city instead of sewn at home. I remember watching Nung that day, beautiful in red silk, already counting something in her eyes that had nothing to do with love. I told myself I was being unfair. A new daughter-in-law deserves patience, deserves the benefit of doubt. I gave her both. For years. Hung passed 6 years ago, in early spring, when the wind was still cold enough to need a jacket in the mornings. Heart failure, sudden. The kind that gives you no time to say the things you meant to say for 40 years, but never quite managed. I sat beside his bed at the district hospital and held his hand until it went cool, and I have not, since that day, stopped feeling the particular silence of a house meant for two people but holding only one. I kept his altar exactly as he would have wanted it. Fresh incense every morning, fruit replaced every few days, his photograph dusted weekly with a soft cloth. And in the wooden box on the altar shelf, beneath a folded square of red cloth, the 1,990 survey map remained, where he had placed it himself, untouched, waiting. I never imagined I would need it again. I assumed it was simply a piece of history, a record of a man's careful work, a private memory between my husband and me. I was wrong about that, the way I have been wrong about very few things in my life. It began, as these things often do, with kindness offered too quickly. 3 months after Hung's death anniversary last year, Nyung came to me on a Sunday afternoon with a folder of papers and a voice softer than I had ever heard from her. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Hung and I had eaten 10,000 meals together, and she told me she wanted to help. Mother. She said she had started calling me that only after the wedding, and it always sat strangely in her mouth. Like a borrowed coat, the land laws are changing again next year. Everyone says the commune is updating all the old paper records into the new digital system. If we don't update the deed now, while it's still simple, it could become very complicated later. Expensive too. Lawyers, fees, delays. I said nothing at first, only poured her tea, the way I poured tea for everyone who sat at this table. Friend or stranger. I already spoke to someone at the land office, she continued. A young man named Dart. Very capable. He handles cases like this all the time. He said he could come out, do a quick verification measurement, update everything properly into your name, clean and modern. No headaches for you or for Koa, or for us later. It sounded, on its surface, like exactly the kind of help a younger generation owed an older one. I had spent 28 years inside the machinery of land administration. I knew, better than almost anyone in this house, how often old paper records genuinely did need updating. How often families genuinely did benefit from a clean modern deed instead of a fragile, fading, hand-drawn map from another era. But I also knew something else. I knew that quick verification measurement was a phrase that meant nothing and everything, depending on who held the tape. Who is paying this Dart for his time? I asked. Nung's smile flickered, just slightly, before she recovered it. It's a service fee. Standard. I already paid it myself, so you wouldn't have to worry. I thanked her. I told her that sounded sensible, that I would think about it, that these things shouldn't be rushed. She left that afternoon, looking pleased with herself in a way that made the back of my neck feel cold, the way it used to feel cold whenever a file crossed my old desk, with numbers that almost matched but didn't quite. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning while I was hanging laundry behind the house, I heard voices near the garden fence. I came around the corner with a basket of wet clothes still in my arms and found a man I didn't recognize, crouched at the edge of my mango tree, a measuring wheel in his hand, a clipboard propped against his knee. He wore a government-issue shirt, pale blue, with a name badge I couldn't read from that distance. Beside him stood Nung, arms crossed, nodding at something he was saying, pointing toward the back corner of the property where the old bamboo fence met the neighbor's land. "Excuse me," I called out. "What is this?" The man straightened quickly, offered a polite, professional smile that didn't match the way his eyes flicked toward Nung before answering me. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Dart, from the district land office. Just doing a standard verification survey, updating the boundaries into our new digital records. Won't take long." "No one told me a survey was scheduled for today," I said. I told her, "Mother," Nung said smoothly. "Last week. You must have forgotten." I had not forgotten. I remembered every conversation in that kitchen with the precision of a woman who had spent half her life cross-checking other people's words against the documents that followed them. But I said nothing more. I set down my laundry basket and stood at the edge of the garden, arms folded, and I watched. I watched the way Dart's measuring wheel rolled across the soil, stopping at points that seemed, to my eye, slightly closer to my mango tree than the old fence line had ever sat. I watched him write numbers onto his clipboard without ever once consulting an existing map, without once asking me where the original boundary markers were, without once mentioning the commune archive that should have held a copy of every survey ever filed on this land. A real verification, I knew from 28 years of doing this work myself, begins with the existing record. You pull the file. You compare it to the ground. You note the discrepancy, if there is one, and you explain it. You do not simply walk onto a piece of land with a wheel and a clipboard and invent new numbers as though the past had never been written down. I said nothing of this to either of them. I only watched, the way I had always watched, letting my silence do the work that accusation never could. When Dart finished, he folded his clipboard under his arm and gave me a polite nod. We'll have the updated documentation ready within a few weeks, ma'am. Your daughter-in-law has my number, if there are any questions. Your daughter-in-law has my number. Not you. Not the woman whose name was actually on the land. I watched them walk together toward the front gate, heads bent close, voices low, and I felt something settle in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something older and steadier than both the particular calm that comes from finally understanding the shape of a thing you'd only sensed in shadow before. That evening, I lit incense at Hung's altar as I did every evening, and I stood there a long moment, longer than usual, looking at his photograph in the dim light, at the careful, steady eyes that had measured every inch of this land with his own 2 hands. They think the ground doesn't remember, I whispered to him. But you and I both know better. For the next several days, I did what I have always done when something feels wrong but cannot yet be proven. I watched, and I waited, and I gathered. It is a skill very few people understand anymore, patience as a kind of weapon. Nung's generation wants answers immediately, confrontation now, proof on a phone screen within the hour. I learned my patience inside a commune office with concrete floors and ceiling fans that barely moved the heat, where files sometimes took years to surface, where the truth, when it finally appeared, always rewarded the person who hadn't rushed to speak too soon. I began, quietly, the way I had begun 1,000 small investigations during my working years, by retracing what I already knew. The afternoon after the survey, once the house was empty and the heat of the day had softened into evening, I took down the wooden box from Hung's altar shelf. My hands were steady, though my heart was not. I unfolded the red cloth inside, and there it was, exactly where it had rested for 35 years. The 1,990 survey map, his handwriting still sharp despite the yellowing paper. The commune seal still legible in faded red ink at the corner. I spread it carefully on the kitchen table and studied it by the light of the single bulb hanging above. The way I used to study contested boundary files at my old desk. The measurements were there, exact to the centimeter, the way Hung always worked. The mango tree, the bamboo fence line, the small footpath that ran along the eastern edge toward the neighbor's land, all of it matched what I remembered from 40 years of walking that garden, every single morning of my life. I thought again of where Dart's measuring wheel had stopped, closer to the mango tree than it should have been. If his new numbers held, if his new map became the official record, a strip of land roughly 4 meters wide along that eastern edge land that had belonged to this family since before I was born would simply cease to exist on paper. It would not be stolen outright, not in any way a court would easily recognize. It would simply be redrawn, quietly, the way so much land in this country had been redrawn over the decades, by people who understood that paper, not soil, decides what belongs to whom. And once that paper existed, once Nung had her clean, updated deed in hand, I understood exactly what would come next, because I had seen the pattern 100 times in my career. A family division, a request to split the property between brothers, a fair arrangement in which the newly surveyed extra strip, the strip that didn't officially exist on the old records, but did exist in Dart's new measurements, would somehow end up zoned for my younger son and his wife, while Koa, steady and uncomplaining as always, would be told it had always been this way. I folded the map back into its cloth and returned it to the box, my hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the particular fury that comes only late in life, after you have spent decades learning to control it. The following morning, I did something I had not done in the 6 years since my retirement. I dressed carefully, my good blouse, the dark plum one I save for formal visits, and I walked the 15 minutes into town, to the district land registry office, the same building where I had worked for nearly 3 decades, where half the staff still remembered me by name. I told the young woman at the front counter that I wanted to request a certified copy of any historical survey records on file for my address. I gave her the lot number from memory, the way I had given lot numbers from memory my entire working life. She disappeared into the archive room for what felt like a very long time. When she returned, her expression had changed slightly. Careful, professional, but careful. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm seeing a notation here that a verification request for this property was submitted 2 weeks ago, currently pending review, filed under." She paused, scrolling on her screen, "File under Mr. Trine Mindart, and the original 1990 survey." I said, "Does it still exist in your archive?" She typed for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "It should be here, but the digital index is showing the file." As she paused again, longer this time, frowning at her screen, "It's showing as recently accessed and checked out for internal review 3 days ago." I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, though my face, I am certain, did not change at all. "Checked out by whom?" I asked. She looked up at me then, and something in her expression told me she already understood. This was not a simple bureaucratic question. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said quietly. "I'm not authorized to share that information." I thanked her, calmly, the way I have thanked 100 clerks for 100 unsatisfying answers over the course of my life, and I walked home through the heat of the late morning with my heart beating very steadily and very fast at the same time. Someone had pulled the original file from the district archive 3 days ago, and the only copy left in this world, that I could be certain still existed exactly as Hung had drawn it, sat folded in red cloth, inside a wooden box, on an altar in my own front room. If they knew that, they would come for it next. The phone call came on a Thursday evening, 3 days after my visit to the registry office, while I was washing rice for dinner at the kitchen sink. It was Koa, my older son, and the moment I heard his voice, I knew something had shifted. He doesn't call often during the week. He's usually on the highway, hauling freight between here and the city. But that evening his voice had a strange flatness to it, the sound of a man trying very hard to keep his hands steady while he speaks. "Mother," he said, "did you know Nyung and her husband went to see a notary in town yesterday?" I set down the rice bowl slowly. "About what?" "About splitting the property. Our property. The garden." He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background, the hum of his truck idling somewhere off the highway. I only found out because I stopped by the house to drop off some fish for dinner, and I saw the paperwork sitting on the kitchen table. A proposed division. My name on one section, his name on another, with a note attached, a new survey reference number, dated this month. My hands had gone very still on the edge of the sink. "There's something else," Hoa continued, and now his voice dropped lower, almost reluctant, the way a son's voice drops when he is about to say something he wishes weren't true. "The division line. It runs straight through the eastern edge of the garden, right past the mango tree, and on the new line, that whole strip, the one near the bamboo fence, it's marked as belonging to his and Nung's section. Not yours, not even part of the shared family land anymore. Just theirs." I closed my eyes for a moment, the water still running over my hands, cool and indifferent to everything happening around it. "There's one more thing," he said, and now I heard something close to apology in his voice, as if he were ashamed to even be the one telling me. "The paper had your signature on it, Mother, at the bottom. approving the new survey measurements as accurate. The rice bowl slipped from my fingers and clattered into the sink. I had signed nothing. In 60 years of handling documents, first as a clerk, then as a wife managing household paperwork, then as a widow managing it all alone, I had never once signed anything. I had not read 3 times over, top to bottom, every clause, every number. I knew, with absolute certainty, standing there with water running over the rice grains scattered in the basin, that whatever signature sat at the bottom of that division proposal was not mine. "Read it to me," I said quietly. "Word for word, if you can." Koa read what he remembered, an authorization clause, stating that the property owner, Vorthirlan, had reviewed and approved the updated boundary survey conducted by Mr. Faze the Tees, Treen Min Dart, and consented to the proposed division of the land between her 2 sons according to the new measurements. Below it, a signature, my name, written in handwriting close enough to mine to fool a stranger, but not close enough to fool the woman whose hand had formed those same characters for 70 years. I have a saying my mother used to repeat to me as a child, one I had not thought of in years, until that moment standing at the sink. "A borrowed knife cuts the borrower first." She meant it as a warning about deceit, that whatever weapon you steal to harm someone else eventually turns in your hand and wounds you instead. I thought of it now, of Nung sitting with a notary, presenting a forged signature as casually as she might present a grocery list, certain that an old woman's handwriting could simply be imitated, and no one would ever look closely enough to notice. She did not understand that I had spent 28 years training my eye to notice exactly this kind of forgery. I had caught dozens of them over my career. Falsified inheritance documents, fraudulent land transfers, signatures traced from old paperwork and pressed onto new forms in the hope that no clerk would bother comparing strokes and pressure points. I knew, better than almost anyone in this province, precisely how a forged signature differs from a real one, even when it looks identical to an untrained eye. "Mother, are you there?" Hoa asked, his voice tight with worry now. "I'm here," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "Don't say anything to your brother, or to Nung, not yet. Bring me a copy of that paper, if you can, without anyone noticing." "What are you going to do?" I looked toward the front room, toward the altar where the incense had long since burned down to ash, toward the wooden box that held the one piece of paper in this entire conflict that no one could forge, because no one but Hung's own hand had ever touched it. "I'm going to remember who taught me to read a document," I said. "And I'm going to make sure they remember it too." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long while, the rice forgotten in the sink, the evening settling into full dark outside the window. Somewhere across town, in a notary's office, or in the comfort of her own home, Nung was likely celebrating, certain that a forged signature and a friendly land official had handed her 4 meters of garden that had belonged to this family for 2 generations. She had no idea that the moment she put a false signature on paper, she had handed me something far more valuable than the land itself. She had handed me proof. I did not sleep much that night, but it was not grief that kept me awake. It was the particular, focused alertness I remembered from my best years at the commune office, the feeling of a puzzle finally showing its edges after weeks of scattered, disconnected pieces. By morning, I had a plan, the kind I used to draft in my head during my walk to work each day, organizing evidence, the way I once organized case files, chronologically, methodically, leaving no gap an opposing party could slip through. The first thing I needed was the forged document itself, in my own hands, not just relayed second-hand over the phone. Koa came by that afternoon on his way out of town, slipping a folded photocopy into my palm at the doorway like we were exchanging something illegal, glancing back over his shoulder, out of habit, even though no one else was around. I sat at the kitchen table and studied it the way I used to study, contested files, magnifying glass in hand. An old one of Hung's, kept in the drawer with his other surveying tools for 30 years, never thrown away. Because I never throw away anything that might still prove useful. The forgery was good. I will give Nung that much credit. Whoever had traced my signature had clearly studied an old document of mine closely, copying the general shape of each character with reasonable accuracy. But forgery, like a counterfeit bill, almost always fails in the details no untrained eye thinks to examine. My real signature has a particular hesitation at the start of my family name, a habit left over from my father, correcting my handwriting as a girl, telling me to slow down before I commit ink to paper. This signature had no hesitation at all. It moved in one smooth, confident, unbroken line. I am not a smooth, confident signer. I never have been. Whoever forged this did not know me at all. They only knew what my name looked like on paper. I made 3 photocopies of the document that same afternoon and tucked them into different places around the house. One inside an old cookbook in the kitchen, one folded into the lining of my winter coat in the wardrobe, one given quietly to a neighbor I trusted, a retired schoolteacher named Ba Hoa, who had known me since before I was married, with instructions to keep it safe and say nothing. That evening, I walked into town again. This time, not to the registry office, but to the small private print shop near the market square, run by a young man named Tuan, who had once been a student of mine when I briefly taught evening literacy classes at the commune hall decades ago, back when the office still asked retirees to volunteer their time. He remembered me immediately, bowed slightly out of old habit, and asked what brought me in. I asked him quietly whether he had the equipment to examine ink density and paper age on a document, the kind of forensic comparison that could show whether 2 signatures came from the same hand at different times, or 2 different hands at the same time. He did not have professional forensic tools, but he knew someone who did. A cousin who worked at a private legal services office in the provincial capital, someone who handled exactly this kind of dispute for a living. It will cost a little, Tuan warned me. I have savings, I said. 40 years of savings I never had a reason to spend. He smiled at that, the smile of a young man who still remembered an old woman correcting his handwriting decades ago, patient but unforgiving of carelessness. Then let's see what carelessness looks like under a magnifying lens. Lan. I left him the photocopy and a small advance payment, and walked home that evening with something close to lightness in my chest, the particular satisfaction of watching a trap close not through anger, but through patience. There is a saying about bamboo that I have always loved. One my grandmother taught me when I was very young, watching the bamboo grove behind our childhood home bend nearly flat in a storm and then rise again, unbroken, the moment the wind passed. Bamboo bends but does not break. I had spent the last several days bending, accepting Nung's sweet voice at the kitchen table, watching Dart's measuring wheel roll across my garden without protest, listening to my son read me the details of a forged signature without raising my own voice once. I had let the wind pass over me without resistance, but bamboo that bends is not bamboo that has surrendered. It is bamboo gathering the strength in its roots to stand straighter than before. That night, before bed, I lit incense at Hung's altar one more time, the smoke curling thin and steady toward the ceiling in the windless room. I looked at his photograph for a long moment, at the patient, careful eyes that had once measured this very land with such precision that 35 years later, his work would still hold more weight than a falsified signature dressed up as truth. You always told me, I whispered, that paper doesn't lie. People do. I touched the edge of the altar lightly with my fingertips. I'm going to remind everyone of the difference. 2 weeks passed, and during that time, Nung's confidence bloomed into something close to triumph. She began speaking openly at family meals about finalizing the paperwork, about a contractor she'd already contacted to discuss building a small guest house along the eastern edge of what she now considered her section of the property. She spoke about it the way people speak about a vacation already booked, already paid for, already certain. At one Sunday lunch, she brought out a printed rendering on her phone, a sleek little structure with a tiled roof and a covered porch, positioned, I noted with a calm I did not show on my face, almost exactly where my mango tree currently stood. We'll need to clear some of the old trees. Of course, she said lightly, scrolling through the images for the table to see. but it'll be worth it. Modern, useful space. Much better than just letting weeds grow back there. The mango tree had been planted by Hung's father, before either of us was born into this family. It had given fruit every summer for over 50 years. I had climbed it as a young bride, to hang lanterns for our first tet together, the year before Koa was born. I said nothing about any of this at the table. I only nodded, the way I had learned to nod at meetings where I disagreed completely, but knew the moment for disagreement had not yet arrived. My younger son, watching his wife with the soft, slightly helpless affection he'd shown her since their wedding day, added that Dart had promised the official updated land certificate would be ready within the month. Clean and modern, he said, echoing Nung's earlier words exactly, as if she had rehearsed the phrase with him in private. No more confusion about old boundaries. I watched them both. This young couple, who believed they had already won, who spoke about land my husband had measured with his own hands, as though it were simply theirs to redesign on a whim, and I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not rage exactly, but its older, colder cousin, resolve. A few days later, Nung came to the house alone in the late afternoon, while Hoa was away on a delivery and my younger son was still at work. She found me in the garden, kneeling beside the vegetable patch, and she crouched beside me with an expression I had rarely seen from her, something close to genuine warmth, though I had learned by then never to trust warmth, that arrived precisely when it was useful. "Mother," she said softly, "I know change is hard, especially at your age, especially after everything with Father's altar and all his old things." She glanced toward the house, toward the front room, where the altar sat. "But I promise you, once the new deed is finalized, everything will be so much simpler. No more worrying about old paperwork, no more confusion. I just want what's best for this family." I looked at her then, really looked, the way I used to look at a file I suspected of fraud, searching not for what was said but for what trembled slightly beneath it. "What's best for this family?" I repeated quietly. "Or what's best for your guest house?" Her smile flickered, just barely, the way it always did when something true slipped past her composure. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," I said, and I returned my attention to the vegetable patch, pulling a weed free with steady, unhurried hands. "But it doesn't matter right now. You go ahead and plan your guest house. Nung. Plan it carefully." She studied me for a long moment, clearly unsettled by my calm, the same way she had been unsettled at the death anniversary dinner weeks earlier when her cruelest words had landed on nothing but silence. I think, looking back, that this was the moment she should have grown suspicious. Instead, she mistook my stillness for surrender, the way people so often do with quiet women of a certain age, assuming that silence means weakness, that patience means a lack of power, that an old woman kneeling in her garden has nothing left in her hands but soil. She left that afternoon looking satisfied, already texting someone, Dart, I assumed, or the contractor about scheduling the next steps. That evening, my phone rang. It was Tuan, from the print shop, his voice low and careful the way it gets when someone is about to tell you something they know will land hard. "Ko Lan," he said. My cousin finished the analysis on the signature. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the phone pressed close to my ear, the last of the evening light fading through the window behind me. "The forgery is confirmed," he said. "Not just stylistically inconsistent, the ink itself is from a ballpoint cartridge manufactured after the document's claimed signing date. My cousin says it would hold up easily in a formal dispute. There's also something else." He paused, and I heard papers shuffling on his end. We cross-referenced the new survey numbers against the regional land database. The measurements Dart submitted don't match any standard verification protocol. They were typed directly into the system without an accompanying field log, which is required by regulation. It looks like he simply entered new numbers and stamped them as official. I closed my eyes, the weight of what I already suspected now sitting in front of me as fact, solid and undeniable. "There's one more thing," Tuan said, his voice dropping further. "My cousin found a pattern. This isn't the first property where Dart has filed measurements without a field log. There are at least 2 others in the district over the past year. Both involved boundary disputes between family members." I sat very still in my kitchen, the phone warm against my ear, the incense from Hung's altar drifting faintly through the doorway behind me, and I understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that what I was facing was not simply a daughter-in-law's greed. It was something larger, something that had likely already cost other elderly people in this district. Pieces of land they had spent their whole lives protecting, all because someone in a position of trust had learned how easy it was to make the truth disappear with a stamp and a signature no one thought to question. The deepest wound did not come from the forged signature, or the stolen measurements, or even the guest house rendering Nung had shown so casually over Sunday lunch. It came 2 days later, when Koa called again, his voice this time not flat with caution, but cracked with something closer to grief. "Mother," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't know how." I waited, the phone pressed to my ear, standing in the same spot by the kitchen sink, where I had first learned of the forged signature weeks before, as if my body had already decided. This was where difficult truths were meant to be received. "I went to see Dart myself," he said, quietly, "on my own. After my last delivery route brought me near the district office, I wanted to ask him directly about the survey, see his face when I asked." He paused, and I heard him take an unsteady breath. He let something slip. He didn't mean to, I think. He was nervous, talking too fast, trying to convince me everything was legitimate, and in the middle of it, he mentioned father. My hand tightened around the edge of the counter. He said. Hoa's voice wavered. He said that Nung told him the original 1,990 survey wouldn't be a problem, because, in her words, the old man who drew it is long dead, and dead men don't object to corrections. The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly around me. I gripped the counter harder, my knuckles whitening, and for a moment I could not speak at all. Dead men don't object to corrections. I thought of Hung at 25, kneeling in the dirt with his measuring chain, dust on his trousers, the small private smile he gave only to me when he came home that evening in 1990 and said, "I made it official. Our garden. Exactly as it is. No more, no less." I thought of his careful handwriting on that map, every numeral perfectly formed because he believed sloppiness could cost someone their home. I thought of his hand growing cool in mine at the district hospital 6 years ago. In early spring, the wind still cold enough to need a jacket. She had called him an old man. She had called his life's careful work a correction, as though the truth he had measured and stamped with his own 2 hands was simply an inconvenience to be edited away now that he could no longer stand up and defend it himself. I thought of the proverb my grandmother used to say about the river still water runs deepest, and I understood now, standing in my kitchen with my son's broken voice still in my ear, that the depth Nung had never bothered to notice in me was not separate from my grief for Hung. It was built from it. Every quiet evening I had spent lighting incense at his altar. Every photocopy I had hidden in cookbooks and coat linings, every patient hour at the print shop, waiting for forensic proof, all of it had been, without my fully realizing it until this moment, an act of love for a man who could no longer protect his own legacy. "Mother," Hoa said softly, "are you there?" "I'm here," I whispered, though my voice did not sound like my own. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have told you that part." "No," I said, finding my breath again, finding the steadiness that had carried me through 28 years of commune work and 6 years of widowhood. "You were right to tell me. I needed to know exactly what we are fighting." After we hung up, I walked slowly into the front room and knelt before Hung's altar, lowering myself onto the worn cushion I kept there for exactly this purpose. The incense had burned down to a thin curl of ash. I lit a fresh stick with trembling hands, watched the small flame catch, and then settle into a steady glow, the smoke beginning its slow climb toward the ceiling. "They said you don't object anymore," I whispered to his photograph, my voice breaking for the first time in this entire ordeal. "They think because you can't speak, your work doesn't matter. They think paper without a living voice behind it is worthless." I pressed my palm flat against the cool wood of the altar table. "They are wrong, Hung. They are so wrong. You taught me that paper outlives everyone who touches it. You taught me that the truth, once measured and stamped, doesn't need a living voice to defend it. It only needs someone willing to bring it back into the light. I reached up and opened the wooden box, lifting out the folded red cloth, setting it gently in my lap. I did not unfold the map this time. I simply held it, the way I might have held his hand if he were still here, and let myself weep quietly in front of his photograph for the first time since the day the forensic results confirmed what I had already known in my bones. Grief and fury, I have learned, are not opposites. They are the same root, growing in two different directions. When I finally rose from the cushion, my knees stiff, my face dry again, I folded the cloth carefully back around the map and returned it to its box, my hands no longer trembling. "You're not gone," I said to the photograph, my voice steady now, almost calm. "Not as long as I'm still standing." After that night, something in me settled into a different kind of quiet, not the patient watchfulness I had practiced for weeks, but something closer to the stillness before a storm finally breaks. I spent the following days, the way I had once spent my final months at the commune office before retirement, organizing every document so thoroughly that no question could be asked without an answer already prepared. I made a complete folder. The forensic ink analysis from Tuan's cousin, confirmed in writing on official letterhead. The forged division proposal Hoa had photographed at the kitchen table. A written timeline of every interaction with Dart, dated and detailed, down to the morning he stood at my mango tree, with his measuring wheel, and never once asked to see an existing record. And beneath all of it, protected in its own clear plastic sleeve, the original 1990 survey. Hung's handwriting as sharp and certain as the day he drew it, the commune seal still legible after 35 years. I also made 2 phone calls I had been postponing, both to people I had known during my years at the commune office. The first was to a former colleague, now retired herself, who still maintained close contact with the Provincial Land Inspection Bureau. I asked her, carefully, whether complaints against a district land officer could be filed anonymously while an investigation gathered evidence, to avoid alerting the officer before the case was solid. She assured me this was standard procedure, and she gave me the name of an inspector who handled exactly this kind of corruption case. The second call was to Ba Hoa, the retired schoolteacher who had kept one of my photocopies safe in her home for weeks without ever asking why. I told her I would need her soon, as a witness, not to testify about anything dramatic, simply to confirm, if asked, that I had given her the document on a specific date, establishing a timeline no one could later dispute. She agreed, without hesitation, the way old friends do, when the request, however strange, comes from someone who has earned that kind of trust over 40 years. I did not confront Nung. I did not raise my voice at a single family meal, did not mention the forged signature, did not let even a flicker of what I now knew show on my face when she spoke about her guesthouse plans, when she mentioned, almost gleefully, that Dart had promised the finalized deed within the week. There is a particular discipline in letting someone walk fully into the open before you close the door behind them. I had learned it first as a young clerk, watching a senior officer wait patiently for a corrupt vendor to sign a contract in his own hand, before producing the evidence that would unravel him entirely. I had learned it again as a wife, watching Hung quietly verify a boundary dispute for an entire year before presenting his findings at a single decisive meeting, never raising his voice once, never tipping his hand until the moment the truth could not be denied. Bamboo bends in the storm, but it does not break. And more than that, it does not announce, in advance, exactly how far it intends to bend before it finally straightens. On a Thursday evening, 10 days after Koa told me what Dart had let slip about Hung, Nung announced at dinner, bright and triumphant, that the finalized land certificate would be ready by the following Monday. Dart himself, she said, had agreed to come to the house personally to walk the family through the new documentation, given how significant the change was. My younger son smiled, relieved that the long process was finally ending. Hoa said nothing, his eyes finding mine briefly across the table, a silent question passing between us that I answered with the smallest, calmest nod. I told them all that Monday sounded fine. I even offered, my voice perfectly even, perfectly warm, to host the meeting myself, here at the house, with tea and a proper meal afterward, to celebrate the family moving forward together. Nung looked delighted. That would be wonderful, Mother. I'll let Dart know. I smiled at her then. The same small smile I had worn at the death anniversary dinner weeks earlier. The one that had confused everyone in the room because it gave nothing away. That night, after the house had emptied and the dishes were washed and put away, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my folder of evidence spread before me under the single bulb's light, the same way Hung once spread his survey map for me by lamplight 35 years ago. I read through every document one final time, checking each detail the way I had checked thousands of files over the course of my career, leaving nothing to chance. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling faintly against the tin roof of the kitchen extension, the first sound of a coming change in the weather. I looked toward the front room, toward the altar where the incense sat fresh and burning, the smoke bending sideways now in the draft, before straightening again toward the ceiling. Monday was 4 days away. I closed the folder, squared its edges with both hands, and set it beside the wooden box on the altar, where Hung's photograph watched over it in the flickering light. They had no idea what was coming through that front door, with the tea and the documents, on Monday afternoon. Monday arrived with a sky the color of unpolished silver, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more honest than usual. I spent the morning the way I spend every morning: incense at the altar, rice washed for the afternoon meal. The floor swept clean, but underneath the routine, my hands moved with a precision I hadn't felt since my final years at the commune office, when every document I touched might be the one that mattered most. By 2 o'clock, the kitchen table had been cleared and reset. A fresh cloth laid over it, the good teacups taken down from the high shelf, the ones we used only for guests of consequence. Dart arrived first, prompt and professional, a leather folder under his arm, a polite smile fixed in place. He wore his government shirt, freshly pressed, and shook my hand with the easy confidence of a man who had done this exact performance many times before in many other households. Nyung arrived soon after, with my younger son, glowing with the particular satisfaction of someone who believes the hardest part is already behind her. Hoa came last, quiet as always, taking the seat closest to the altar without being asked. I poured tea for everyone, slow and unhurried, the way I had poured tea my entire life. Dart opened his folder and began speaking about the updated certificate, gesturing toward a clean printed map with crisp blue lines marking the new boundaries. The eastern strip, near the mango tree, now clearly labeled under a different name than mine. Everything has been properly verified and documented, he said smoothly, sliding the paper toward the center of the table. Once you sign here today, Mrs. Lan, the new certificate becomes official, and we can move forward with the family's plans. I looked at the paper. I looked at him. I'd like to ask a few questions. First, I said, my voice calm, almost pleasant, the voice I used to use at the commune office when I already knew the answer, and simply wanted the room to hear it spoken aloud. You mentioned this was properly verified. Can you tell me which field log was used for the new measurements? A flicker crossed his face, brief but unmistakable. The standard protocol was followed, of course, which is, a field team measures the boundary, cross-references existing records, and, which existing records? I asked, still gentle, still pouring tea, as though this were the most ordinary conversation in the world. Because when I visited the district registry 2.5 weeks ago, the clerk informed me that the original 1,990 survey for this property had been checked out of the archive 3 days earlier. Checked out by you. The room went very still. Nung's smile had not yet broken, but it had begun, very slightly, to tighten at the edges. That's standard procedure when conducting a verification, Dart said, recovering quickly. We often reference historical files. Then you did reference it, I said. Good. Then you'll remember that the 1,990 survey places the eastern boundary 4 meters further from the mango tree than your new measurements do. I reached beneath the table, where I had set the folder earlier that morning, and laid it gently on the cloth between the teacups. I happen to have a certified copy of that survey here, along with the original itself, kept safe for 35 years. Perhaps we should compare the two, since you've already seen them yourself. I opened the folder and slid the 1990 map across the table, Hung's careful handwriting catching the afternoon light. The commune seal still sharp and red after all these decades. Beside it, I placed the forensic letter from Tuan's cousin, the one confirming that the signature on the division proposal, my signature, had been written with ink manufactured well after the document claimed to have been signed. Nung's face had drained of color by the time I finished arranging the papers, but her voice, when it came, still tried for its usual lightness. "Mother, I think there's been some confusion. I'm sure Dart can explain." "I'd rather hear you explain the signature," I said, turning to look at her directly for the first time since she had walked through my door that afternoon. "Since I never signed this document, and the ink confirms it was written months after the date it claims." The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular density of a room realizing, all at once, that the comfortable story it had been telling itself was no longer holding together. My younger son looked between his wife and the documents on the table, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to dawning horror. "Nung," he said quietly, "what is she talking about?" "It's a misunderstanding," Nung said quickly, too quickly, her eyes darting toward Dart, as though looking for rescue. Dart handled the paperwork. "You told him," I said, my voice still even, still calm, though something underneath it had finally allowed itself to surface, that the old man who drew the original survey was long dead, and dead men don't object to corrections. The cup in Nung's hand trembled slightly against its saucer. I let the silence stretch a moment longer before I continued, my eyes moving to the altar across the room, to Hung's photograph watching quietly over all of us in the soft afternoon light, the incense still burning, the thin line of smoke rising straight and unbroken toward the ceiling. "You were wrong," I said simply, "about the dead not objecting. They simply need someone living, willing to speak for them." Koa had gone very still beside me, watching his sister-in-law's composure crack in real time. Dart had begun gathering his papers back into his folder, with hands that were no longer quite as steady as they'd been 20 minutes earlier. "This is a serious situation," I continued, my voice never rising, never breaking its careful, measured rhythm. "Forgery of a signature on a legal document, falsification of a government land survey, conducted without the required field log. I've already spoken with someone at the Provincial Land Inspection Bureau, and I believe an inspector will want to review everything currently in this folder, along with whatever similar files exist for the other properties Mr. Dart has apparently handled this year using the same method." Dart's face went the color of old paper. "Other properties?" my younger son repeated, looking between Dart and his wife, with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something closer to betrayal than confusion now. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited, the way I had waited my entire career for the truth to finish doing what truth always eventually does in a room full of people no longer willing to look away from it. What happened next did not require a single raised voice from me. It required only the documents on the table, and the particular speed with which frightened people begin protecting themselves at the expense of everyone they had previously called family. Dart was the first to move. He stood abruptly, mumbling something about needing to verify a few details back at the office, his folder clutched tight against his chest, as though it might shield him from what was already in motion. I let him reach the door before I spoke again. "Mr. Dart," I said, my voice carrying easily across the small room. "I should mention that I filed a formal complaint with the Provincial Inspection Bureau 3 days ago, along with copies of everything on this table. An inspector named Mr. Fong has already been assigned to review it. I expect he'll be reaching out to you directly within the week." Dart's hand froze on the door handle. He did not turn around. He simply stood there for a long moment, his shoulders sinking slightly, before he stepped out without another word. the screen door clattering shut behind him in the rising wind outside. Inside the house, the silence he left behind was worse than anything he could have said. Nung had gone very pale, her earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to panic. "Mother, please. You don't understand the whole situation. I only wanted what was fair for us, what we deserved." "What you deserved," I repeated quietly. "Tell me, Nung, what exactly did you think you deserved from a man you called dead and unable to object?" She had no answer for that. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, the way Dart's had during the survey weeks earlier when I'd asked him a question he hadn't prepared for. My younger son finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady, directed not at me but at his wife. "You forged Mother's signature. You told that man my father couldn't object because he was dead." He shook his head slowly, as though trying to dislodge the words from somewhere they didn't belong. "How long has this been going on?" "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Nung said, her voice cracking now. The careful sweetness she had always worn around me finally stripped away entirely. "Dart said it would be simple. A quick adjustment. No one would even notice." "I noticed," I said simply. "I have spent my entire life noticing exactly these kinds of adjustments. It is the only skill anyone ever properly taught me, and I am very good at it." I reached for the teapot and refilled my own cup, slow and unhurried, the same gesture I had made at the death anniversary dinner weeks earlier, when she had called me an old failure in front of the whole family, and I had said nothing at all. The symmetry of it was not lost on me. Then, my silence had confused her. Now, my calm undid her completely, because she finally understood there had never been any silence at all. Only patience, gathering evidence the entire time. My phone rang on the table beside me. I glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number with the provincial area code, and answered it calmly, putting it on speaker without asking permission, because I wanted everyone in that room to hear exactly what came next. "Mrs. Vorthierlan? This is Inspector Fong from the Provincial Land Bureau. I'm calling regarding the complaint you filed last week." "Yes, Inspector. I have you on speaker. My family is present, including the parties named in the complaint." A brief pause, then the inspector's voice continued, official and unhurried. "We've completed a preliminary review of the documents you submitted, along with the forensic letter regarding the signature. I want to inform you that this isn't an isolated case. We've identified 2 other properties in the district with similar irregularities tied to the same land officer over the past year, both involving falsified field measurements and family land disputes. Given the pattern, we'll be opening a formal investigation, and Mr. Dart will be suspended from his position pending the outcome." I watched Nung's face as the inspector spoke, watched the last of her composure dissolve entirely, watched my younger son's jaw tighten as he absorbed the full weight of what his wife had helped set into motion. Not against a stranger, but against his own mother, his own brother, his own father's memory. "There's also the matter of the forged signature," the inspector continued. "That falls under criminal forgery statutes. I'd recommend you consult with legal counsel about whether you wish to pursue formal charges, though that decision is entirely yours." I looked across the table at Nung, who would not meet my eyes now, who sat with her hands clenched in her lap, the gold bracelet on her wrist no longer catching any light at all in the dimming afternoon. "Thank you, Inspector," I said. "I'll be in touch about next steps." I ended the call and set the phone down gently on the table, the silence afterward heavier than any words could have made it. "I'm not going to press charges," I said finally, watching the relief flicker across Nung's face, before I continued, "Not because you don't deserve consequences, but because I don't want my grandchildren growing up visiting their mother in a courtroom instead of at our family table." I paused, letting that land fully, but the land stays exactly where the 1,990 survey places it. Every centimeter. And there will be no more talk of guest houses on ground that was never yours to build on. My younger son looked at his wife for a long moment, something fundamental clearly shifting behind his eyes, the kind of shift that doesn't resolve itself in a single afternoon but begins, undeniably, in this exact moment. Outside, the wind that had been building all week finally broke into rain, sudden and heavy, drumming against the tin roof of the kitchen extension, washing the dust from the mango tree's leaves in the gathering dark. The investigation concluded 6 weeks later. Dart was formally removed from his position at the district land office, and the provincial bureau issued corrections, restoring the original boundaries on all 3 affected properties, mine included, based on the surviving 1,990 surveys and supporting archival records. I never pursued the forgery charge against Nung. I had meant what I said at that table. I wanted my grandchildren to grow up visiting a grandmother, not a courtroom. But something in our family did not simply return to what it had been before. It couldn't. Some things, once spoken aloud and proven on paper, cannot be folded quietly back into silence. My younger son and Nung stayed together. Though the marriage I witnessed afterward looked different than the one before, quieter, more careful, the easy confidence she'd once carried replaced by something more humble, more watchful of her own words. She apologized to me only once, in private, several weeks after that Monday afternoon, sitting across from me at this same kitchen table without an audience this time. I don't know if I fully believed every word of it, but I listened the way I have always listened, and I told her that respect, once broken, has to be rebuilt, the same way a survey line gets redrawn slowly, carefully, with someone willing to measure twice before marking anything as final. Hoa visits more often now, not out of obligation, but because something between us settled more firmly into place during those weeks of quiet investigation, the way 2 people who have weathered the same storm together often find themselves standing a little closer afterward. He still drives his truck up and down the highway, still calls most evenings just to talk, his voice no longer carrying the strain it held the night he told me what Dart had let slip about his father. Last month, on a clear morning in early autumn, I called a family meeting of my own, not at a notary's office, not with forged paperwork hidden under polite smiles, but here, in this house, at this table, with the 1,990 survey, spread openly, in the center where everyone could see it. I told them I was formally transferring the property into both my sons' names equally, exactly as the original survey defined it, with the eastern strip near the mango tree included as it had always belonged. Undivided, unchanged, exactly as Hung had measured it with his own 2 hands 35 years ago. I am not a wealthy woman. I never sought to become one through this ordeal. I sought only to make certain that what my husband built with such patient, exacting care would not be quietly erased by someone who mistook silence for permission. Koa wept a little when I said it, the way steady, uncomplaining men sometimes do when something they never expected to receive is finally placed gently into their hands. My younger son thanked me with a kind of solemnity I hadn't seen from him since his father's funeral. Even Nung, sitting at the edge of the table, said nothing at all, only nodded, her eyes lowered toward the old map as though seeing it, perhaps for the first time, as something more than an obstacle to her own plans. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the front room as the light faded outside, the way I do most evenings now. I lit incense at Hung's altar, watched the thin gray smoke rise straight up before catching a faint draft and bending sideways, then straightening again toward the ceiling, exactly as it had on the evening this all began. I thought about something my mother used to tell me. Watching the river behind our childhood village, calm and unhurried on its surface, while the current beneath ran steady and deep enough to carry anything that dared underestimate it. Still, water runs deepest. I had carried that current quietly for so many years through the commune office, through widowhood, through every small humiliation. People offer an old woman they believe has nothing left to give, and I understood now, more fully than I ever had, that the depth wasn't something I had built in defense. It was something Hung and I had built together, decades ago, one careful measurement at a time, never imagining it would someday need defending at all. I touched the edge of the wooden box on the altar, the same box that had held the truth safely for 35 years, waiting patiently for the one moment it would finally be needed. They thought you couldn't object anymore. I said softly to his photograph, the incense smoke curling gently around the frame. But you never stopped speaking. Hung. I just had to be the one to finally say it out loud. Outside, the evening settled quiet and golden over the garden, over the old mango tree standing exactly where it always had, its roots running deeper into this ground than anyone who had tried to redraw its boundaries had ever bothered to imagine. Still water runs deepest, I thought one last time, watching the incense smoke rise and bend, and rise again, unbroken. And the deepest water, I had learned, always finds its way home. To every parent who has ever been quietly underestimated by the people they raised and loved the most, the ones who mistake a soft voice for a weak one, who confuse age with foolishness, who believe silence means you have nothing left to defend. Please remember this. Patience is not surrender. The quiet ones are so often the ones still watching closest, still keeping the truth safe long after everyone else has stopped looking for it. If this story moved you, give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. It truly helps this small channel grow. If you were in her shoes, would you have forgiven as quickly as she did, or held your ground a little longer? Let me know in the comments below.